Buon pomeriggio, good evening, or good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here in Perugia again. My name is Antonio Zappulla. I'm the CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, where we work to strengthen free, fair, and informed societies using the power of information and using the power of the law. And media freedom is one of the core areas of work for us, and we are particularly interested in issues at the intersection of the media and the law. In other words, we're really interested in understanding how the law can enable but can also hinder media freedom. There was a great panel earlier today at 11. I don't know if you had a chance to go to and attend that panel, but it was a really good starter for the conversation that we're having here today, this afternoon, because it really started articulating some of the emerging threats that we are seeing around the world, articulated and played against independent journalism around the world. And just a reflection, last year we were here in Perugia, we were hosting a panel discussion precisely on the legal threats against journalists, and there was only one session in the program. And this year, not only we have our own tag, but we have actually 5 sessions discussing the same topic. So my reflection is actually, it is a great sign of the fact that this is being perceived increasingly within the media freedom and media development and journalism community, no longer as a niche issue. However, I guess the next step for us as a community, as a group of practitioners and people who do care about this issue, is really being able to make the next step, which is to take this issue to the broader community of people who read and consume news, governments who pass legislation and policy, and also the donors who have to step up their role and really embrace this fight. We're going to be talking a lot about how this is increasingly becoming no longer an issue, but an issue that really dents the fundamentals, the foundations of our democracies around the world. And in the past few years, we've seen the challenges against journalists, the legal challenges and threats against journalists becoming more complicated, more complex. And we've also seen how the community needs to come together and to step up and respond in a way that really allows us to hold the line and step up the fight. And so at the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we've done 2 things. We teamed up with the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, and with Media Defense to create the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk, which wants to be a single entry point into a wider ecosystem of support for journalists that do indeed require assistance, legal assistance for litigation and many other things that we're going to be talking about today. And then we teamed up with Columbia University, with Joel, and a fantastic lineup of researchers to really produce a first academic report that does document these challenges, because we thought it was important that these challenges were actually documented, and through that research that we're launching here today, really being discussed with a wider audience, precisely the audience, as I was mentioning earlier, consumers, donors, and practitioners. And so what we're going to do in the next hour is delve into the report with Joel, and then really allowing the other speakers to analyze some of the issues that have been described within the report, and really ideally discussing some of the solutions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Joel Simon, who is the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at City University in New York. Joel served as executive director of CPJ from 2006 to 2021, and he was a fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University in 2022, and that's precisely when this project started. The report is out today. There's a QR code that you can scan to read it, and if you are too far and you can't scan that QR code, you can visit medialegalattacks.com, and that's where you'll find the report. The report, you'll see, identifies a number of trends, a number of risks that we're seeing emerging, and there's also videos within the report. We'll play 2 of them very quickly today, just to give you a sense of what we are discussing. So Joel, thank you for being with us in Perugia. It's great to have you here for the first time.
Not hardship duty to come to Perugia. Fantastic.
Who are we targeting with this report? Who's the target audience?
I think the target audience is tutti. It's everybody, right? I mean, but let's be a little more specific. I think you mentioned, look, if you're a journalist and you're doing this kind of work, you know what the risks are. The legal practitioners, because they're defending the journalists, they know. But the broader community of journalists and policymakers, I think, was not fully aware. Even in my role, when I was running the Committee to Protect Journalists, I don't think I had a full appreciation for just how profound this threat is. There were certain things I was aware of. The number of journalists in prison around the world has been rising steadily year upon year. And we reached another record at the end of last year, 363 journalists imprisoned around the world. But what I think what we sought to document in this report was the array of legal tactics and strategies available to the enemies of press freedom, and to catalog those risks and to frame the discussion for advocates who are defending journalists, for journalists themselves, and for policymakers and funders, which really need to enter the fray here.
So if we go into the report, one of the threats that clearly emerges as one of the major threats is defamation, right? It's one of the most serious threats to independent journalism. You could argue that it's been the case forever, although in the report it looks like the past 5 years are emerging as a bit of a watershed moment. What's changed in the past 4 years?
Well, I think a couple of things have changed. One is that there was a period maybe 10 years ago, when we started to make ground in terms of international jurisprudence and with policymakers that criminal defamation violated international guarantees under human rights law. And we saw that there was a reversal in many parts of the world. These laws were taken off the books. But what we've seen in recent years is that they're being put back on the books in a number of surprising places: Russia, Cuba, but also Japan, which surprised me. So defamation is re-emerging as a threat. And the thing that makes it so useful for those seeking to limit critical expression is, of course, defamation is legitimate. Defamation claims is a civil matter. I mean, in the US right now, with the Fox versus Dominion case, I think there's different views, but there's a broad consensus that this is a legitimate effort to ensure that a media institution is accountable. So that legitimacy itself is what provides the cover for enemies of critical expression to abuse the law and to make it, to weaponize it, which is the very focus of this report.
Also, really interesting to see that we collated this report. We interviewed a number of journalists. The sound bites are available on the website. We don't have obviously time to play them all. But there's one of the bites that really struck with me in this report is the deputy editor of the Polish daily Gazeta Wyborcza, who mentions how his outlet, for example, received more than 100 slaps. Often identical lawsuits filed each time a new article was published. The research treats slaps, strategic lawsuits against public participation, as a separate threat. Yeah. Why did you do that?
Well, we had it. So the methodology we used in the report, we consulted with experts with legal experts and other experts on the matters of the law, and we also did a survey with over 500 journalists in the Thomson Reuters Foundation network. And there were some different views on whether slaps is more of a tactic or whether it really is a separate threat. And many slap suits, which are inherently, they're intended to essentially wear down the recipient of these legal actions. And so they're inherently illegitimate. As I mentioned, defamation claims are not inherently illegitimate, and so there's a distinction. And the other thing is, while slap suits often rely on defamation as the basis, that's shifting, and it's not always the case. So slap suits, by definition, as I mentioned, are intended to, it's a form of legal harassment, a form of lawfare, but a defamation is often the basis for slap action, but it's not always the basis, and so we thought it really merited its own category within the categorization of threats.
One of the issues and one of the trends that is also highlighted in the report is the rise in lawsuits that pertain to non-speech related crimes. I thought that was one of the most fascinating one, especially perhaps one that the people outside the community don't necessarily know. And so we're talking about financial crimes, we're talking about corruption, money laundering. And I would like to play a short clip from Jose Zamora, who's the son of Jose Ruben Zamora, a journalist and the owner of El Periódico newspaper, who's currently behind bars in Guatemala, allegedly for money laundering. Let's play the bite and then we'll come to that.
My name is Jose Zamora. I am a journalist and the son of an imprisoned journalist in Guatemala. His name is José Rubén Zamora, and he's the founder of El Periódico. Over the years, governments have used different tactics to persecute and silence journalists, from financial boycotts and defamation campaigns to assassination attempts and death threats. In the case of my father, they fabricated a case against him in 72 hours that allowed them to arrest him and to imprison him. They know once they have you in their system, it's very difficult to fight back because they control the entire judiciary, prosecutors and judges. Governments and repressive regimes have identified that criminal law is very effective because they can pursue a journalist, criminalize him, attack his credibility without having to pay the toll of attacking them physically or assassinating them.
So you just met José Rubén Zamora, was it last week? Or?
Yeah.
What are the implications of this? Obviously beyond financial, I guess there is a reputational, there is an emotional toll that this takes on journalists.
Well, I had a chance to visit him in prison. He's basically in solitary confinement in a high security prison. He's initially lost 22 pounds. He's gained 8 back. He's a personal friend. I've known him for many years, so it was quite distressing to see him in these conditions and looking frail. But one of the things that his son, Jose, mentioned is, they tried to assassinate him several times. They broke into his home, they held a gun to his head. One time they drugged him and they left him basically on a cold mountain road outside the city. His enemies whose corruption he's exposed in Guatemala, he was hit with 40 slap suits, so 40 defamation claims, and he just kept right on going. And this is the first time he's really been stopped. These are, in my view, and I think the view of anyone who's looked at them seriously, completely trumped up, made up allegations of money laundering and extortion. But he's now in the legal process. The government controls every aspect of it, from the prosecutors to the judges. His lawyers have actually been indicted, so he can't get legal help. Journalists who've written about him and supported him have faced legal charges. And even when I had meetings with government embassies in Guatemala, they pointed out that they felt that I don't necessarily buy this, but this was some of the resistance I got, that, well, it's difficult for them to find a point at which they can intervene because this is a matter of sovereign law. So it's a very effective strategy, and on top of all of that, it's deeply damaging to his credibility and his reputation, and the reputation of the news organization. So from the government perspective, it's an extremely effective strategy, and I think it's one that the report shows is increasing around the world. And I think those of us who care about press freedom and are committed to defending the rights of journalists, particularly in the legal community, need to think really deeply about what the most effective response to this new threat might be.
And this idea of attacking the reputation of journalists is something we've seen obviously in the Philippines as well. And the report talks about cyber libel, and obviously the most famous case is the one of Maria Ressa and Rappler. I would like to play another soundbite. This is Glenda Gloria, who's the executive director and the co-founder of Rappler.
The cyber libel conviction of Maria Ressa and Ray Santos Jr. has really emboldened those in power in the Philippines to use the law to silence independent newsrooms and independent journalists. In fact, after their conviction, we had to face various libel complaints from other political actors too. The climate of fear is palpable, not just in the Rappler newsroom, but in other newsrooms in the Philippines. Because if a court and the executive department could do something to a Maria Ressa, how much more the lesser-known journalists out here? As far as senior management of Rappler is concerned, we also had to refocus our energy from growing journalism, from nurturing the business, to actually defending our case in court. and also our case before the public opinion. Because given the lies and the disinformation against the independent newsroom and against Rappler, we have had also to focus our attention to responding to these lies and to countering them. This has had tremendous impact on the way we do things, but it has also inspired us to really fight for press freedom and hold the line.
There's so much in this soundbite,
Yeah.
right? There's the distraction, the financial cost, the climate of fear. If this happens at the newsroom of a Nobel Peace Prize winner, what happens elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely overwhelming and crippling. I mean, we're going to talk in the next session, I think, about some of the really interesting and innovative responses to this threat. I think that's absolutely essential. But legal action, I think one of the reasons it's so effective is because it not only has a chilling effect, it makes it extremely difficult for the media organization itself to continue, just because of the drain on resources and time, with their critical reporting. So, I mean, I think I want to actually take a moment to give a shout out to my co-authors, Carlos Lauria and Una Flores. And one of the things that Carlos did in preparing this report was he really identified and reached out to what we call the spotlight cases. And I will say that's another thing that, in preparing this report, that really sort of humanized the situation for me. Obviously, I was aware of this, but hearing these kinds of testimonials, from somebody like Glenda, really just brought home in a very visceral way what this feels like and what this represents for independent media organizations on the front lines.
The research also talks about recommendations.
Yeah.
And one of these is obviously more substantial legal support for journalists. I was reflecting earlier on the fact that it feels good that there is more opportunity to talk here in Perugia about these legal threats. The conversation clearly has gained momentum, at least within this community. When can we expect a significant financial commitment to follow suit? Because that is the point, right? We are fighting a battle, and we can't do it without money.
Well, I mean, when can we expect it? I mean, you might know better than I hope soon, because, I know Jody Ginsburg is going to be up here on the stage in a moment, and I know she'll be talking about this, but she mentioned this morning at the complimentary panel that I think many of you attended, that, there are things that could be done. And the legal community, you mentioned NJAR, there's Reporters Shield, there's a lot of really exciting initiatives, but they cost money. Legal defense is expensive.
Extremely expensive.
Extremely expensive. And so, and the other thing that we have to recognize is that governments are extremely adaptive, and enemies of press freedom are extremely adapted. So whatever, energy we put into responding to the current threat, the threat will change and will evolve, and we have to be prepared for that reality. So this is really going to take resources, and I think that was one of the things that, when we first conceived of the report, that we wanted to kind of make clear in terms of framing the issue. This is a huge challenge. It's a huge threat. The number of journalists imprisoned around the world is skyrocketing. The number of journalists facing legal action is skyrocketing. The nature and complexity of those threats is growing more profound. The impact on critical journalism is growing every day. And if we want to meet the challenge, then I think that's the clear message, is that funders need to step up and support the kind of advocacy efforts that we'll be hearing about in a moment.
Joel, thank you for your time, thank you for your contribution. The report is live. Go check it out. Thank you for having us. We'll continue with the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Hello. Oh. Hi, everyone. Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. My name is Will Church. I'm the director of the Media Freedom Program at Thomson Reuters Foundation. I work for Antonio. Today, we wanted to take a bit of time, in the time we've got left, to look at some reflections on the report from those who work in this community and look at some of the solutions. We've got 34 minutes to look at those solutions. But as Antonio alluded to, and as Jody talked about this morning, like this is becoming part of a bigger and bigger conversation, which we're really delighted to see. I think one of the objectives of the report that we're launching, and even of Perugia itself, is to make sure everyone is pulling in the same direction on a number of key issues. And I think we're starting to see the fruits of that. I'm joined up here by a very distinguished panel who don't really need any introductions, but I will. Lina Atala, co-founder and chief editor of Mademoiselle. I had a lesson on pronouncing that earlier. Jody Ginsberg, the president of the Committee to Protect Journalists, and Chile, Eboe-Osuji, a distinguished international jurist at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University, and also a member of the high-level legal panel of experts on media. So, quick reflection. If I could start with you, Lina, you know, as a newsroom leader, as a journalist, we've talked about these issues. How are they affecting you? Do you see them growing? Are they, you know, how substantial are they for you?
So I work in a newsroom in Cairo. It's called Mademoiselle, and we've been facing the whole spectrum of legal actions. So everything from office raids by security forces to arrests of myself and fellow journalists on the team, as well as prosecutions, court cases against us, and that keeps going. You know, I identify a lot with what the Rappler executive editor said in the video report we just saw, which is the massive distraction that takes place when these things happen. I remember vividly when our office was raided back in 2019 because of an investigation we did about the political elite in Egypt. It was basically the office was raided, some of us were arrested for a few hours, there was massive pressure to release us, but what came after was massive work to basically rebuild the house. It was basically an operation that took 2 days, more or less, between the raid and the arrests, but it took a good month to actually put the house back in order because of, you know, the very basic thing from the office being destroyed, basically having to rehabilitate the journalists who were kept hostages in the office. And all of that while we are a news gathering organization, so we have a responsibility to be back on our desks every day doing what matters. So on one hand, of course, the distraction is the main effect of this. On the other, you know, we are very careful that the distraction doesn't turn us into just basically victims of this legal repression. In a sense, because it's very hard to operate with a process of legal defense that can protect us against a lot of legal claims that are constantly put against us, the utter and ultimate protection for us is actually the work, is keeping doing the work. So we are very cognizant of the fact that while we have a big responsibility to respond to the legal threats, to, you know, up our legal defense game, invest in more legal support, and expand our legal strategies, we are very conscious that this needs to be constantly paralleled with not only the continuation of our work, but actually the constant improvement of our work, because it's actually the power of the journalism that we do that ultimately protects us, not necessarily, unfortunately, the legal defense.
Right, right. And there are sort of so many threats packed into that. And actually, Jody, CPJ is working across all these threats already. Legal is just like another one thrown in. Like how much of CPJ's time is this now taking? Is this a growing, more serious threat?
It is a growing threat, and that's one of the reasons why along with the Thomson Reuters Foundation and the Media Legal Defense Initiative, we established the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk because we could see growing numbers of journalists facing these kinds of threats, needing this kind of assistance. And one of the key things is that we know that legal threats are often a precursor to more serious threats, that they might precede online harassment, might precede physical violence, might precede obviously arrest, but also potentially actually end up in killings. So it's really important that we tackle the legal threats to prevent the more serious threats occurring. And one of the challenges isn't simply the volume, it's also the complexity. As we heard from Joel and from Antonio, one of the key issues is that we've moved away from simple defamation laws. We've moved away from governments and other authorities merely going after journalists for their journalism. They have become wise to that, so they're going after journalists for other things. You know, suddenly journalists are all tax evaders and money launderers, and that makes it much more difficult because those kinds of cases are much more complex, they're much longer, they're much more expensive, and what they also do is reinforce this idea that we've heard time and time again recently from political leaders that journalists are criminal, that journalists are wrongdoers, and it reinforces that because they literally do become criminals in this way. It's certainly the case we're seeing with Jose Ruben Zamora, with Jimmy Lai and others, that it's cementing in the mind of the public that the journalist is a criminal. And so unpicking that becomes extremely challenging.
Yeah, so it's getting worse and worse, basically. So Chile, you represent the law. There are some recommendations in this report, but from your perspective, is there any hope here?
Oh, thank you very much. Well, yes, I am the lawyer on the panel, so I represent the law. Of course, what makes it complicated to begin with is what everyone has recognized here. There was a reason for the idea of defamation law to begin with as a premise from time immemorial, being to ensure that people don't take the law into their own hands, so that people who feel that they have been really genuinely defamed would have an outlet, go to the law to have their rights protected. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the dark side of the law, as it were, and there is such a thing. What is he talking about? If we stopped to think that it took the law to sustain apartheid government, it took the law to sustain slavery in some countries, it took the law to say to men at some point, you could rape your wife, and so on and so forth. So those are abuses of the idea of the law. But the good news in all of that, if there is such a thing as good news in this context, is that there is something called law reform also. And that is where society pressures those who make the law to reform them so that laws are not abused, so laws are kept for the distinct purpose for which they are designed. And so those laws I was talking about, eventually we don't have apartheid laws in South Africa anymore. We don't have segregation laws in the US as such anymore. We don't have, rape shield laws and so on and so forth. So it was only in 2009, wasn't it, that the UK, again, due to law reform, got rid of the sedition laws in the UK, which was a colonial law that was transported all over the place, that England had colonies. But it again is that hope in saying that if the pressure is relentless enough and sustained enough, we can hope to have those odious laws changed in the end. Okay,
great. And sorry, coming back to you, Jody. Do you see the pendulum swinging at all? Do you see any, I mean, what would you do? Do you see any initiatives on the horizon or already kicking off? And sorry, a quick added question, building on what Antonio and Joel were talking about. You talked this morning quite passionately about the need for funding. I'd also put that question to you, like, where do you think that funding is going to come from? We know it's a very resource-poor industry.
Well, so media is a resource-poor industry. The law isn't always. It's just that our branch of the law is not always the best funded. So we need to encourage those who would, who are more involved in other forms of the law to become more involved in this. But we don't just need that pro bono support, we also need increased funding in all senses and not just through government initiatives. I think there is hope, and I think there's hope in a number of areas. There are exciting initiatives that are happening. So there's things like the Journalist Shield, the project of OCCRP and others, the Vance Centre and others, which is starting to deal with the defamation question. There are increasing numbers of people who are aware of these kinds of challenges, of the use of particularly financial legislation and accusation to go after journalists, and that's becoming more understood, and that's progress. And I think with more understanding will come more solutions, including, I think, the use of targeted sanctions, for example, against those individuals and entities who would try and abuse the law to target journalists in this way. I think thinking about media entities as investments in a country is really important. So I think there is that cause for hope. There are initiatives coming forward. I think being able to have more collective action through things like the Legal Network for Journalists at Risk is really important, because being able to speak out in defense and support one another is a key tool. So the fact that we are having more conversations about this year is a really important step, I think, to then the next step, which is that we can start to push back against these kinds of things. And being able to talk about it, I think, also includes pushing back against some of the narratives where we, I think... So this morning, Keelan Gallagher, Casey, talked about asymmetric warfare as a way in which governments and others attack journalists. And I think we probably, as the journalist community, haven't got used to that asymmetry quite yet. So we're still using the language of fairness and balance because that's what we've been taught as journalists, but that's not what our opponents are doing. And so we often do things like sort of repeat the accusations of governments verbatim without much challenge, thereby reinforcing the narrative that that individual is in some way a criminal. And so I think we need to be smarter about even the way that we are reporting these kinds of charges and accusations.
That's very interesting, and yes, Keelan's made some super points earlier. Actually, Chile, from a legal point, the report talks about, it makes a recommendation about how, it's not a recommendation, it's an observation that the law is a very powerful tool for media freedom if used in the right way. Keelan talked about, paraphrasing, but fighting fire with fire, using creativity in the laws to defend those working in this space. From your perspective, how can the law be used creatively to provide this sort of protection?
It requires a lot of thinking about possibilities and, like you said, creativity. One argument I've been making recently, I wrote a piece on just security on this very question. And if you've tried the same old things and nothing is changing, it's time to think about new approaches. And one possibility, it will not solve the case in every instance, but at least it will create pressure on those who do this sort of thing, is to think about using international criminal law. That's what I've done in the last 25 or more years. International criminal law. There's something called crimes against humanity. And that's in it, when you have, it's defined as widespread or systematic attack. against the civilian population when certain crimes may be committed in those contexts, including murder, persecution, right? And some of these attacks against journalists can qualify or can at least be seriously examined from that perspective. The value of that sort of approach is in instances where you can situate an attack against a journalist as part of a widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. Two things can result out of that if in the right case. One would be something that the ICC prosecutor, you are journalists, you know how to create this source of pressure. Encourage the ICC prosecutors to look carefully at a certain incident, whether it qualifies. So that becomes an ICC case. It removes that issue from the state that we're talking about and internationalizes it as an approach to remedy. Another thing that can happen is international crimes, particularly crimes against humanity, can be what we call a subject of universal jurisdiction, meaning different states can have, say, look, state A, this came out of your territory, but it is an international crime. Because it is an international crime, we are state B, we are state C, we are state D. Each of us would have jurisdiction over that event. So it removes it again from one state that says, well, this happened in our territory, there's nothing anybody can do about it, to becoming something the world can do something about outside the territory of the state concerned. So that will then get people thinking twice about, look, if we keep doing this thing, are we going to have the international community take this as something they'll do?
Very interesting, and just staying on the theme of international actions here, I wonder also if you could talk briefly about where does one of the recommendations singles out actually the Media Freedom Coalition, and sitting on the high-level panel, I'd be interested to know what your take on what should the responsibility be of the high-level panel to the sector.
The high-level panel, for those of you who know what we do, and for those who don't, there is the Media Freedom Coalition group of states who care about, these are states who care about media freedom around the world, the norm of media freedom. And what we do is we advise them, give legal advice. We do reports, we study burning questions such as the ones you raise, and research the question and write reports and recommendations. We've done a number of those, and we'll continue to do them.
Okay, great. And Lina, thinking of all these solutions we've discussed so far, I wonder how you working in a newsroom in a tricky environment, how they resonate with you. We're talking about some almost like lofty ideas, international law. It seems that it might be come across as quite far removed from the day-to-day. Like if you had a message, like what do you think you or newsrooms in general need from the community? And sorry, a quick follow-up question to that. It would be, one of the recommendations also talks about the sort of the preventative education that could go into newsrooms. We work with newsrooms around the world who barely have time to breathe, focusing on trying to raise a buck, follow the breaking news. Would newsrooms have the capacity to kind of absorb that level of educational support as well?
So yeah, unfortunately, the ideas sound a bit lofty, and it's very hard to think of creative users of the law in an ecosystem that actually uses the law in a very creative way as a tool of repression, primarily. So it's very hard to think around that, and it's very hard to think of the law in that sense, in a way that's isolated from the politics, basically. So the politics that govern the making of the very laws that are used against us, which are politics totally governed by a desire to control on one hand, but also there's the politics of the execution of the law, who executes the law and how. And here we're talking about top executives whose job is basically primarily to use the law against us. So it's very hard to counter this creativity in a way. I think the most important thing is to keep up to date with understanding the changing strategies, for example. So, and that's why I like what you said, Jody, about how it's not just simply about how many journalists they imprison. A lot of governments have gotten the tip that maybe imprisoning journalists get them into a lot of trouble recently, especially if they care about international relations or public image in the West for bilateral interests, for example. So tools have changed in that sense. Governments have managed to drop themselves lower down in the indexes of imprisoned journalists or jailed journalists and so on. Instead, they have been directing themselves towards tools such as licensing, for example, taking away licenses or prohibiting newsrooms from getting a license to operate. And then the whole operation becomes between dusk and dawn illegal, for example. And this is something we're facing. We went into an interrogation session at the public prosecutor, and in the midst of the interrogation, which was about a piece of content, we were surprised to be faced with charges of running our organization illegally because we don't have a license. So basically, how do we, as an international community, pay attention to things that don't usually get a lot of attention, such as the licensing issue, which seem perhaps too technical, too legal, too internal. They don't have the huge human cost of people being jailed. They don't have the glamour of names being thrown into jail, but entire operations are being endangered because of these regulations that basically, you know, are put together in this legalistic performativity of, you know, any media ecosystem has to be regulated, but because of the political ecosystem that we're talking about, they are being used as tools of repression primarily and not as a tool of regulation. So paying attention to these things, having discursive responses to these legalistic performativity of authoritarian states is an important dynamic to have in the international community that cares about ecosystems of freedom of expression in the world. And you know, any educational work is very welcome. I think our teams have a vested interest to get the most protection possible, including through pedagogic exercises of how they can ensure that whatever they do is done in the most solid way possible in order to lower the stakes. Lowering the stakes is part of our strategy in general, our legal strategy in general. So basically lowering as much as possible the room for them to come after us using their legal repressive tools. So getting education on that front is always very welcome. I can't say we don't have time for this. We don't have the luxury not to have time to be careful while also doing our job.
Great, thank you. And in the sort of wrapping out stages, I wonder, Jody, if throwing one out here, like, we've got a few more conversations this week on this type of issue, but when we leave Perugia, what do you think everyone who comes to Perugia needs to leave with? What do we need to do? Because we can have these conversations and there'll be more conversations in New York in a few weeks' time. What really do we all need to go and start working towards?
So we need to work towards building capacity. We need to make sure that we have enough people, both locally and internationally, who are able to provide the legal advice, not just on media law, but also on these broader legal issues, so around tax, money laundering, so that we have really strong defenses. So building a much broader network of expertise and then building up capacity, particularly locally. We need to ensure that there are mechanisms to support, and it goes back to the funding, newsrooms and individual journalists to fight these kinds of cases. They are extremely Byzantine. They take a very long time. They're very expensive. There is a reason that these authoritarian regimes go for these kinds of charges. It's because you essentially not just going after the journalists themselves, but you're going after the whole newsroom. That's exactly what Lena was talking about. It's a very smart way to use, for example, licensing, because that way you go after the whole newsroom and you effectively shut down the newsroom. And that's what's happened. If you look at the case of Apple Daily, for example, that's shuttered. If you look at El Periódico in Guatemala, also had to stop publishing the print version. So it's extremely effective. So not only do you need to provide the funding to fight the legal battle, you also, I think, need to be prepared with a strategy for how you might keep that publication going in another format. One of the other topics that I think is fairly prominent this year at Perugia is exile journalism. We are seeing increasing numbers of journalists go into exile. So thinking about how you are able to continue to support your newsroom if it is shuttered through legal threats elsewhere is a key part of that strategy. So I would want people to go away thinking about not only what legal support they might need if this happened to them, but also contingency strategies for how you might keep your operation going in spite of those kinds of attacks. I think those are really key. And then fourthly, as I said earlier, this sense that we are speaking up loudly against these threats. It concerns me greatly when I hear colleagues, for example, say, well, maybe there's some truth in it. Well, we don't really know. But, because we feel confident on the media freedom question. We feel confident if Madame Asra is targeted for a piece that they published that criticizes the government, we're all confident saying, how dare you go after them for this piece of content? We're very confident about that. As soon as somebody brings a charge that is not essentially content related, people feel very uncomfortable. And so we need to get into a zone of comfort where we feel comfortable saying these are bogus charges, this is fraudulent, this is unacceptable, because otherwise we are feeding back into the narrative that the authorities are using to silence these journalists. And I think I would like everybody to go away feeling more comfortable pushing back.
Yeah, I think that's almost a call to arms, isn't it? That look, everyone who's concerned about these issues needs to get their head around this is a much broader topic now. 8 minutes, maybe some final reflections. Chile, I guess same question actually. What
Me again?
Your legal solutions hat on.
Legal solutions. Perhaps one, of course, there are the cases where there are abuses of the law, as it were. I mean, those cannot be condoned, and they must be, pushed back against. But I also do think that there are things journalists themselves can do as a profession to try at least to lessen the incidence of, I'm not talking about the abusive scenarios, but even in the genuine cases where people with a legitimate claim of defamation may feel they have a suit, I do believe that the profession can do more to stop that happening. Right now, what you have is A, who feels that he or she has been genuinely defamed and feels all right. It's either he or she shuts up on maybe careers destroyed, life destroyed, or go to court and try and redeem some of reputation. So there is nothing in between, either right or worse than that, go to court. But I do think if the profession themselves came up with some self-regulation, put up somebody in the middle that at least can mediate some of these questions about wrongful defamation. It need not be regulation in the sense of saying, well, we are self-regulating like lawyers or doctors or, the priestly professions that will license somebody before they can practice. It need not be that for journalists. It can be something as simple as having a standards board and make it standard in all states, made up of journalists themselves with integrity, to whom people can complain, to say, look, this journalist wrote something that's wrong or false about me, and that standards board can look at it and say, sure, sorry, this is fair reporting, or no, that journalist got it wrong. In that instance where the person gets an opinion, a credible opinion from peers of the journalist to say, this journalist got it wrong, it will in a lot of cases, satisfy people from going to court, because people really don't want to go to court. They feel they have to go to court because they've got nowhere else to go. Their reputations have been destroyed. I do believe that if journalists do this as a standard around the world, it can lessen some of the need for slap concerns.
Yeah, so a strong desire to keep as much as possible away from court is a good thing, I think. But obviously that type of approach happens in various forms in various countries around the world, and I guess it just needs quite a lot of looking into. And finally, Lena, journalist in the room, a call to arms for the community here at Perugia.
I was telling a colleague earlier today that because of the different legal battles that we're having to fight, I really hate how we have to be framed a lot of the times in this survivor frame. And I think that actually our way of survival is the journalism itself, is the content making itself. So it's really a call for journalists out there to stand to be protected, not necessarily by the law, again, in an ecosystem that does not respect the law as a balance of powers. It's very hard to feel protected by the law, but rather to feel protected by the power you build by producing independent content that people need, that makes it very hard for the government to eventually crack down on you. So basically, the protection of the profession is what matters for me.
Super, super. I have to admit that I'm neither a lawyer nor a journalist, but in my 13 years at Thomson Reuters Foundation, I've worked almost exclusively with lawyers and journalists, which means certainly I've never won an argument at work, but also I've seen those two communities with the bit between their teeth, and when they get going and have a mission, I'm inspired, and I have no doubt we'll get there. Thanks all for your time, and let's keep this conversation going. And thanks to panelists, mostly.